The River Ouse bisects Pathfinder country. To the north of the river, acres of the ancient forest lands darken the road with shadow. But suddenly, through a gap in the trees, the far horizon is glimpsed across the dead, flat, peaty land that slopes down towards the southwest. Rain draining off the airfields could make the sleepy, almost motionless, ouse into a torrent that overflooded its banks and filled the shady lanes with deep mud, even in high summer. For there were many airfields. Or, put another way, just one airfield. And over it, the winged monsters slid, as once went the pterodactyls that are still found fossilized in the nearby chalk quarries. The day was half gone. The machines were ready, and the daily inspection forms initialed. The drone of circuiting bombers had not ceased since early morning. Creaking door got the green light from control, and Lambert's right hand pushed the throttles gently forward as he had 1,000 times. He kept the port ones slightly ahead to correct the swing. Behind his shoulder he felt young Battersby leaning against him to let him know he was there. He brought the tail up quickly. There was that exhilarating feeling of the back of the seat pushing hard against the spine as 5,000 horsepower gripped the air and 50,000 pounds of aeroplane teetered on tiptoe before relinquishing the last touch of spinning tires on runway. Battersby took the throttles, sliding his hand under the pilots, as before him Mickey Murphy had done for 15 NFTs and the 15 operations that followed them. Now Lambert needed both hands to haul back upon the control column and force the dark nose up through the horizon. Lambert gave the rudder bar an extra touch, for Battersby hadn't kept the port throttles quite far enough ahead. Cohen was calling out the airspeeds from his indicator beside the navigation desk, 95, 100, 105, and then suddenly, creaking door was airborne. Battersby had seen the rudder bar movement and corrected the throttles precisely. "Climbing power," chanted Lambert. "Climbing power." Battersby answered. "Wheels up. Wheels up." There was only sky. The horizon had dropped out of sight like a spent hoop. "Flaps up. Flaps up." Battersby closed the flaps, and there was a grinding sound as they slid back into the wings. "Cruising power." Battersby didn't move the throttles with the considerate slowness that an airline check captain would approve. He altered their position with an abrupt indifference that slowed the forward speed with a jerk and changed the roar to a lower tone. The nose dropped a trifle. The Lancaster assumed its flying stance. "Just one round the garden," said Lambert. It was a way of telling Cohen that he wouldn't need fixes or navigation for the short trip. There was a click as a microphone was switched on. "It's meat pie," said Digby from the front turret. He should have been behind Lambert on takeoff, but he preferred to be in front, and Lambert didn't mind. "But late lunches will probably have potato cheese." "Skipper," said Binty Jones from the top turret. "Is that glycol on the port inner?" Lambert looked out. He was fond of this aeroplane. Seen through this aged perspex, the world was not bright and new, but ancient and yellowed like parchment, polished 1,000 times. The windows had become a delicate optical system that edged the landscape with halos and made of the sun a bundle of gold wire. He looked at the engine covers, battered by riggers' feet and chunks of ice. There was around each panel screw a white calligraphic cross-hatching of screwdriver scratches. From the exhaust dampers came a blue, feather-like jet of flame. Its heat had baked the oil spill upon the cowlings. Like antique enamelware, the dark brown stains shone with a patina of deep reds and rich greens. Above the exhaust pipes upon the matte paint of the engine cover, there was one shiny patch. It was catching the bright afternoon sunlight and gleaming like a newly minted penny. Battersby also glanced at it briefly, but then turned back to his panel. He was determined to do his job by the book, better than Murphy even. "Fuel pumps of all tanks off," reported Battersby. No warning lights. A coolant leak can be real big trouble, said Binti, always a Jeremiah. What do you think, engineer? Asked Lambert. It's just an oily footmark, said Battersby. I saw the rigger do it. I should have had it wiped. I'm sorry. He didn't turn away from his panel. Lambert looked at the mark again. It was the shape of a rubber toe. He tapped Battersby on the arm so that he looked round. Lambert grinned at him. The white-faced engineer was relieved not to be reprimanded. That generator behaving batters? Perfectly. Skipper. Digby was full length in the nose, watching the sunny landscape slide under him. He switched on his intercom. Skipper, did they tell you what it's going to be tonight? As always, when Digby was trying to wheedle something, his accent had become more nasal, drawing each word to its fullest possible extent, like soft chewing gum. Yes. Thanks, said Lambert. He leaned to his right and bent his head low to watch Digby's reaction. Come on, Skipper, said Digby, looking back to him. Give us the gen. It's Hamburg, volunteered Jimmy Grimm, the wireless operator. The orderly room WAF told me. The blonde job. Big deal, said Binti scornfully from the upper turret. Who told her? The groupie last night in bed? Skip, coaxed Digby. I've got the calculations to do. I should be told. It's a 5-tank job, 2,154 gallons, said Lambert. Squinting into the hot sun coming through the nose panel, Digby nodded. Lambert continued, The whole squadron is bombing the shit out of Adelaide. They all heard Binti's catcall of joy, even without his intercom. That's the one. Skipper, said Flash Gordon from the rear gun turret. You pom bastards, said Digby cheerfully. Sticky beak, said Lambert. It was one of Digby's favourite insults. Jimmy Grimm hunched lower at his table, under the racks of radio equipment, and grinned. He was sending the favourite operator's test signal. Best bent wire, best bent wire, best bent wire. Who knows who first invented this strange phrase with its jazz-like rhythms, known to RAF operators and Luftwaffe monitoring services alike. Lambert began a gentle turn. Under the banked wing, the green countryside tipped slowly forward like a child's soup plate waiting for a spoon. The Great North Road was black with traffic. Long military convoys and civilian lorries lumbered slowly down England's ancient spine. Lambert looked at the dazzling blurs made by the air screws and superimposed them as he juggled the throttles. Watching the stroboscopic effect enabled him to synchronize the engines. Lambert noticed that Battersby was looking at him. He grinned. Then he ruined the harmony and pointed to the throttles for Battersby to try. Binti heard the motors go out of sync suddenly and said, "What's the matter with the motors?" "Nothing," said Lambert. "Battersby is handling the controls." "Then let me off," said Binti. "Don't be a fool," said Lambert. "It's better that he should know as much as possible." There was a fearful silence. Northwest of Huntingdon, the countryside changed suddenly. No more weatherboard houses and thatched cottages, now yellow brick dwellings and rusty sheds, windswept allotments full of caterpillar-nibbled cabbages, shallots, wire fences and old cars propped on wooden blocks until petrol supplies returned. Here the fields were brightly coloured, light yellow, gold, green potato fields and bright blue ones full of cabbages. Round came the flat, angular fens and the ooze through which had waded Angles, Saxons and Jutes. Danish Vikings, too, had plundered this land and left their names upon the map. The circle of Bourne airfield came into sight, and around it the hovering flies that would be with them tonight. Godmanchester, unmistakable. 2 Roman roads like spokes in its central hub. "Another lark ahead," said Digby. It crabbed along, the wind pushing it askew. It was not of their squadron. Nor was it a training flight from Upwood OTU or Woolfox Lodge. Lambert looked at the strange Lancaster. He tried to see it anew as though he had never seen a Lancaster bomber before. It was a brooding machine, 30 tons of it, even counting motors and turrets as one and excluding nuts. Bolts and rivets, there were 55,000 separate parts. Over 3 miles of electrical wiring, generators enough to light a hotel, hydraulics enough to lift a bridge, radio powerful enough to talk to a town on the far side of Europe, fuel capacity enough to take it to such a town, and bomb load enough to destroy it. Lambert held his speedboat. It was just enough to close distance, inch by inch. Is this the view a fighter pilot will have just before pressing the button that will blow them all into eternity? Tonight, the prim red. White and blue roundels on the plain ahead were symbols of Britain. Its brown and green upper surface was a formalized version of the land, ploughed and verdant, over which it flew. Like primitive voodoo objects, the brightly painted aircraft defied the enemy, and upon them were painted the little formalized yellow bombs, or symbols of aeroplanes destroyed, that showed how powerful was the magic they could work. Lambert had seen enough of the other Lanc. He had got too close for comfort. Lambert moved the control column and adjusted the throttles and pitch control. Creaking door lifted like a show jumper, leaving the other plane far below. That was better. Even a sneeze from a nervous gunner was enough to send a bomber into violent evasive aerobatics, and like most pilots he feared mid-air collision more than flak and night fighters put together. "Stop climbing!" Straight and level while he saw where he was. 6 or 7 miles away to starboard, the countryside lapped around Cambridge, a ramshackle rash of workers' dwellings and speculators' suburbia. In its centre, lush with green courts and beflowered backs, the great university. Its spires, grinning like dragon's teeth, daring the untutored to seek admittance. Beyond this citadel the countryside turned green again, and there were more airfields. Below him passed RAF Oakington, Lancasters dotted along its perimeter. Gentle turn, Worley somewhere off to port lost to sight amongst the fenland. He saw the other Lancs turn that way. This was the flying Lambert liked, in the clear light of a fine summer's day. This was how he'd fancied it would be on the day he'd volunteered. Lambert was flying straight and level now. No compass needed, for below him, glinting in the sun like a 20-mile-long steel needle, was the man-made Bedford River. Lambert's compass, I call it. The voice startled Lambert. Kosh Cohen was at his elbow, sitting on Battersby's folding seat and staring out of the window like a day tripper. Lambert smiled. "You always come over here?" "Skip," said Cohen. "Is this where you're going to live after the war?" "Perhaps," said Lambert. "Your toy's okay?" Cohen nodded. "Let's go and get some lunch," said Lambert, and he let the nose dip. Cohen folded back the seat and returned to his dark curtained booth. Since Lambert was flying by visual landmarks, there was little for Cohen to do. He had sorted his maps and given the G and H2S the routine test. Although it was notoriously prone to technical failures, he was proud of the top-secret radar set that showed him the ground through fog, mist, cloud, or darkness, like some god bringing wrath to a sinful Babylon. Only selected crews had the new equipment. Lambert's voice came over the intercom asking each crewman if their equipment was in order. Cohen pushed the mask to his mouth to answer yes into the microphone. On his first 2 operations, he had vomited before the aircraft had even crossed the English coast. Apart from the humiliation, it meant that Creaking Door had to lose precious height so that he could clean himself up before clamping the oxygen mask back to his face for the rest of the trip. Now he knew the smell of fear, for it lingered in his face mask and was a constant reminder of the dangers of being too imaginative. He sharpened pencils and prepared the elastic strap that held pencils. rulers and protractors from flying loose during violent, evasive action. He looked at the topmost map and read to himself the names of channel ports. He had passed through them on holiday before the war. He switched his microphone on. "Batters," said Cohen on impulse. There was no answer for a moment. Then the engineer answered. "Engineer here." "Who is it?" "Kosh. Batters. What mob was your brother in at Dunkirk?" There was no reply for some time. Cohen was debating whether to call again when Battersby answered. "I made that up." "I'm afraid," he said. "My brother is in a reserved occupation, an electricity substation." There was a stunned silence over the crew intercom. Then Battersby said anxiously, "You weren't thinking of telling Mr. Sweet?" "No," said Cohen. "I wasn't." Lambert could see Whalley Fen straight ahead. The mile-long runways were distinct on the landscape, like a black chinagraph cross scrawled upon a coloured map. Lambert took a quick look round to be sure there were no other aircraft in the circuit. High above them he saw a thin streak of a condensation trail in the upper atmosphere. The aeroplane making it was just a speck. "Look at him go," said Cohen. Lambert guessed he was standing under the Astrodome. He was like a kid on an outing whenever they were in the air. "It's the Met flight, on his way to look at the weather over our target," said Digby. They looked up at the dot. "With that sort of altitude," said Lambert, "a man could live forever." At 32,000 feet, the Spitfire had begun to spin a white, feathery trail in the thin, moist air. The pilot watched the trail in his mirror and put the stick forward. The highly polished Spitfire Mach 11 responded with a shallow dive. The altimeter needle moved slowly backwards until, as suddenly as it began, the white trail ended. Immediately, the pilot corrected his plane into straight and level flight. This was his optimum safety height for today. No enemy could bounce him from above without leaving a telltale trail. Now he need only watch the air below. He checked the notepad and pencils strapped to his knee for the 10th time. He settled back comfortably and ran a finger round his collar. The cockpit was very warm. Few men had seen the world from this height. Few men knew that it was only a layer cake. A rich green England base with a layer of light green ocean on it. Then Holland, brownish and flecked with clouds along the coastline. Then the distant horizon, perhaps as far as 200 miles away, disappearing into white mist like whipped cream. Upon it blue sky was heaped until it could hold no more. To the Ruhr and back would take the Spitfire only 92 minutes. He'd have time for a game of tennis before tea. In the 13th century, East Anglian wool merchants had brought back from the Low Countries wealth, brickmakers, architects, and a taste for fine Dutch houses. There were many houses as well preserved as Whalley Manor, with its distinctive curved gables and fine pantiles. Before the war, it had been the home of a Conservative Member of Parliament. Art students had regularly come to sketch it. They had sat on the lawn shaded by the ancient elm trees, and had tea and cucumber sandwiches in the terrace room. Now it was the officers' mess of RAF Station Whalley Fen. The terrace room was furnished with long polished tables. Between the tables, white-jacketed airmen moved carefully, setting the lunch plates with white linen napkins and gleaming glassware. Through the folding doors from the anteroom came the cheerful shouts of young commissioned aircrew, and a gramophone record of Al Bowley was playing gently in the background. The sunlight made patterns on the carpet, and the glass doors had been opened to let the tobacco smoke escape. There were 16 Lancaster bombers at Whalley Fen. Each one had a crew of 7. Of these, 112 operational crewmen. 88 were sergeants. The sergeants' mess was a series of corrugated iron huts interjoined. The remaining 24 flyers were officers. They shared this mess with another 48 officers, ranging from the padre to the dental officer, plus some WAF officers like Section Officer Maisie Holroyd. She was a plump 38-year-old woman who had spent 8 years running a cheap meat and 2-veg dining rooms in Exeter. At Whalley Fen, she was the catering officer, and even the people who found the present food unappetizing agreed that she did a better job than any of her male predecessors. The non-operational officers were mostly middle-aged. They wore medals from the First World War and interwar campaign ribbons from Arabia and India, and a very high percentage had pilots' wings on their tunics. Of the 24 operational flyers, 13 were born in Britain. The others were 3 Canadians, 4 Australians, 2 Rhodesians, and 2 Americans who still had not transferred to the USAF. 7 officers wore the striped ribbon of the DFC, including Flight Lieutenant Sweet of B Flight. Had he been asked what his talents were, Flight Lieutenant Sweet would not have put flying a bomber anywhere near the top of his list, nor, which would have surprised his fellow airmen even more, would he have claimed to be a popular leader of men. Sweet felt himself particularly well fitted to be a planner of air strategy. Some of his boyhood ambitions had come to naught, for instance his desire to be 6 foot tall and his ambition to be head boy. In addition, there was his dream of winning the 100-yard sprint and being captain of the Southern Counties Public School Cricket 11. But these were lesser hopes. His desire to be a strategist had not diminished with time, as had the desire to be a professional cricketer. Nor had it become unreal like his hopes of being 6 foot tall. The war would continue for at least 10 more years. Sweet had decided. There was time enough for this ambition. When we had conquered the Germans, the Japs would be next on the list. And look how long the Chinks had spent trying to hold them off, since 1931. After that, we'd probably have to put the Russians in their place. It was going to be a long war, and Sweet had decided to spend the greater part of it on the staff side, making decisions, formulating plans, forging strategy. These were the things of which wars were made. Naturally, a young, ambitious staff officer would have had a dangerous war behind him and a couple of gongs. These would be his credentials, his way of making the old-timers listen to reason. 2 tours of bombers, DFC and Bar, and a job at High Wycombe. This was Sweet's ambition. He could handle a bit of schoolboy German and French. Next, he'd learn some Rusky or Jap, or perhaps even Mandarin. He bought 2 whiskies and walked across to the solemn-faced education officer, an elderly schoolteacher who had joined the station only that week. Education officers were often called schoolmasters, and never more aptly, for this bespectacled pilot officer had, until 10 weeks before, been teaching history and languages at a secondary school in Harwich. "How are you finding things, sir?" said Sweet, deferentially. "Splendid," said the education officer, wondering why he should have been sought out by this gay young hero. "Wizard?" nodded Sweet. "That's Wizard. My name's Sweet. Flight Commander B. Flight. Look, sir, I would appreciate your advice. Considering the way the world is going, the war and everything, you know, I'd like to hear a broader view than we. Quick look round. Get in the mess." The education officer looked at Sweet with interest. It was quite amazing that these boys, in spite of their rank badges and medals, were only a year or 2 older than his 6th form back in Harwich. Younger, in a way, for the war had prevented their minds expanding in the normal manner. They thought of nothing but the technical skills of their job. Most of them failed to realize how narrow and uncommercial those skills were. After the war, the poor devils would suffer when they started looking for a job. Just as he had. As a young infantry officer, after the previous war, a brilliant first year at Oxford, with its crowning achievement, a commission in a yeomanry regiment. My God, what a fool. It goes without saying we are all proud of the sacrifices you have made, Captain, and the decoration you won. But when there are so many men after so few jobs, it would be irresponsible and unfair to our shareholders to take anyone without experience or even a degree. He had gone out and joined the Peace Pledge Union. I remember war, and I will never support or sanction another. And yet here he was supporting another, with these curious young men. How different they were from the chaps he soldiered with in 1914. Half these kids hadn't even got their matriculation exam. He was amazed at the superficial nature of their conversation. Flying, booze-ups and bints, even their cynicism was ingenuous. He said, "I'd be glad to help if I can. It's not really for me," said Sweet. "It's for my cousin. He's a pretty clever chap. No degree. But he could get one at any time. Just like that." Sweet clicked his fingers. "He was asking me a few questions the other day. He thinks my advice is worth taking. Can't think why." Sweet laughed. "He's in the army. He stands a good chance of a job on staff. They are putting together the real brains now to start planning the invasion." "Really?" said the education officer. "Yes. This chap will be a brigadier in no time at all. Anyway, this fellow, Your cousin?" "What?" said Sweet. "Oh, yes. My cousin. He's got German and French pretty well buttoned up, and he's thinking of having a crack at the old Russian or the old Jap. What do you think would be best? Perhaps Mandarin? I mean, you can't tell the way it might go. What would you have advised the chap to study?" "He'd do best to concentrate still on his French and German. Conversational practice, vocabulary building, perhaps working solely with military books." Sweet was looking rather blank. The EO felt that he was expected to continue. He should try translating some of the Manuscrits de 1803 by Baron Fane, who was Secretary of Napoleon's cabinet. Or there's Danilowski's Denkwürdigkeiten aus dem Kriege 1813. I translated a piece of that once to pass the time away in France. Then for the Battle of Waterloo, there's the famous Documents in Edits by the Duc d'Elchingen. If I want to read about our victory at the Battle of Waterloo," said Sweet, "I don't need any French blighter to tell me about it." He laughed ironically. "But for your cousin?" "Oh, my cousin doesn't need that sort of thing," said Sweet. "He thinks internationally, Rusky or Jap. Perhaps you don't think internationally." "I'm afraid I never do," said the education officer. "My cousin always does," said Sweet. "So do I. Look here. Sir, I know that in the First War the trenches in France were full of poets and all that, but because chaps beat the mess up once a week, debag some poor blighter and have a little horseplay, you mustn't think that they are a lot of shallow-minded musclemen. I mean, these chaps do their bit. Some win a gong or two by luck or judgment." Sweet smiled. "But that doesn't mean that when the shouting's over they can't enjoy some good poetry and music and sit down and try and think what the world really means to the common man." "I don't jump to conclusions," said the education officer. "As it is, I'm rather proud to be sharing a mess with so many interesting young men." "Nice of you to say so, sir." The station commander was standing alone near the cupboard full of squadron silver. Sweet thought he was counting it. The mess sergeant thought he was trying to see if the rearmost cups were polished. Actually, he was trying to decide if the command swimming trophy was solid silver or only plated. Sweet turned back to the education officer. "There's an operational matter I must speak about with the station master." The education officer followed Sweet's gaze. "Oh, certainly," he said. "Don't let me hold up the war." He sniffed burned fat and watery cabbage and decided that he wasn't hungry. He missed his wife's home cooking more than he'd thought he would. What good was he doing here? "And thanks awfully," said Sweet, as he moved among the earnest young drinkers around the bar. The light through the glass doors gave them halos of sunshine. Sweet addressed the groupie directly. "All alone, sir? Have I pestered you about my collection for the village children's party?" "Hello, young Sweet." "Yes. You had a quid from me last week. Of course, sir. Your team going to knock spots off those Besteridge chaps on Saturday? I think so, sir, but mind you, Flight Sergeant Lambert is going up to London on a pass. I was rather counting on his slow bowling. 2 of their team played for their county before the war, to say nothing of this professional they've got. But Lambert's set on taking his wife up to London. He says he doesn't like playing for the Air Force. Bad show, that. But I'm sure you'll win. Sweet. I'm going to stonewall for you. Anyway, I've got 10 bob on us. They both laughed, and the groupie bought Sweet a small beer. Sweet said, "There's a story, sir, that you scored a century for 3 Group before the war." That's true enough. I also played for Fighter Command 1 year, before I got this touch of arthritis, or whatever the quack says it is. I was quite a sought-after bat. That's what I heard. Oh, come along, Sweet. I'm sure I've bored you with the story of my batting at Sandhurst, when the umpire tried to catch the ball, and the groupie was launched into his reminiscences where several officers moved aside. For the group captain's stories about his cricket prowess were familiar to most of the mess. His narrative was laced with monosyllabic 4-letter Anglo-Saxon words, which helped the group captain to establish a democratic camaraderie with his virile young officers. This, at any rate, was his theory. For this reason, the mess still had male waiters and barmen when most others had airwomen doing these jobs. The groupie finished his anecdote flushed and happy. He said, "If your team win on Saturday, the chances are the AOC will invite you for dinner." Yes, I'd heard he does that. "Give you a chance to tell him your theories about staff planning and strategy," the groupie said, chuckling. Sweet bowed his head modestly. The groupie said, "But you're a flight commander now." "Sweet. You're finding out a thing or two about running a unit, eh?" "In a small way of business," admitted Sweet modestly, "but I must say I had no idea of the amount of paperwork necessary just to get an aeroplane into the air." The groupie gave a short, ironic laugh. "Now you are finding out where the real war is being fought, laddie. Saturation bombing of airfields with Air Ministry bump. Memos, requests and bloody nonsense, each prepared in triplicate and filed under waste paper." "What?" Sweet smiled at the group captain to indicate how much he shared his contempt for chairborne warriors, especially when all a chap wants to do is get to grips with the damned Huns. "Sir, that's it," exclaimed the groupie enthusiastically. "I'm employed to kill Huns, and by God, my squadron will kill more Huns of all shapes, colours, sizes and sexes than any other in this man's Air Force, or I'll know the reason why." The groupie smiled and self-deprecatingly added, "At least, that's what I've told Air Ministry a few times." "Eh?" "Yes, sir," said Sweet. "In fact, on this matter of killing Huns, there's something you could help with. I say, I'm sorry to talk shop and all that." "Now then," said the groupie, "you know my views about those bloody squadrons where they taboo shop talk in the mess. Well, on this business of killing Huns, sir, there's a pilot, a damn good chap, experienced, decorated and all that, a good NCO, but he told me that he thinks our bombing attacks are just old-fashioned murder of working-class families. Confounded fifth columnist! Yes, sir, I knew you'd be annoyed, but that's not all. This war, he says, is just the continuation of capitalism by other means." That's Karl Marx he's quoting. Yes, it's a misquote of Clausewitz, actually, Sir, it's a bloody disgrace. A chap on my station, you say? Flight Sergeant Lambert, so it might be just a touch of the jitters. Mind you, the groupie's face changed. Lambert again, eh? Still, he's got a good record, hasn't he? And we've got to remember that Karl Marx is on our side now. Got to hand it to the Ruskies. Sweet. They've put up a jolly good show lately, then this Stalingrad business could be the turning point of the war. I only thought, sir, knowing your views on killing Huns, you did right, laddie. I'm a Hun killer, as you well know. Only way to get the war won. I'll be looking into it. If he's going to lose his nerve for killing Huns, it will be better to put the chap on to something he can manage. The mess waiter caught the groupie's eye. He nodded. Cleaning our latrines, for instance. I thought you'd better know, sir. Quite right, said the groupie. But then you usually are, young sweet. But don't say I said so. What? They both smiled. Oh, by the by, sir, well, perhaps you've heard about this little experiment I'm doing on one of the rear turrets. I heard something about it. What are the details? Well, it came to me one morning when I opened the window in order to see more clearly. In the hall, a corporal struck the gong. Its soft sound echoed through the old house. Come along, gentlemen. Let the prisoners eat a hearty lunch. The groupie always said that at lunchtime. In the evenings he said, hearty dinner. He turned back to Sweet. I saw you talking to our new schoolmaster. Nice chap, isn't he? Indeed he is, sir. Sir, a very good type indeed, sir, and gives the mess a bit of style having a VC here. What? VC, or, sir? The schoolmaster, my boy, Pilot Officer Pearson, VC. Don't tell me you didn't make a beeline for that purple ribbon, everyone does. 1917, killed 12 Huns with a sword and dozens more with hand grenades. Held a section of Bosch trench for 2 hours until reinforcements arrived. Fascinating. What? Seeing an officially accredited hero in the flesh? Yes, sir, said Sweet, trying to remember what he had said. But let me tell you about this silly little idea I've had about the perspex in rear turrets. The Lance that Lambert had followed came in to land on Worley Fen's main runway. There were no squadron letters or call signs. No bombs painted on its side. No pet names. There were no guns in the turrets, nor gunners to man them. There was not even an engineer to help with the fuel changeovers or assist with the controls. It made a perfect landing and obeyed the tower's instructions with a care that was unusual. A Hillman car sped out to the bomber and waited while the pilot checked through the procedures with the ground crew and the engineer leader. The engineer officer was Sandy Sanderson, a slim-hipped Lothario who had bet 10 shillings that he'd have lunch with the ferry pilot. He lost. The pilot, a 20-year-old brunette in the uniform of the Air Transport Auxiliary, declined with a knowing smile. Is it dangerous? Her mother had once asked her. Only after you land, mother. As well as flying the 4-motor aircraft entirely alone, she had eaten 3 cheese sandwiches while doing so. By missing lunch, she would have time to get back to the storage unit and deliver another aircraft before finishing work for the day. There were always new modifications on the planes coming from factories, and this group, like most of the others, had special requirements that had to be incorporated. Wing Commander Monroe and Sandy didn't finish their ground inspection until 10 minutes to 3. It was 3:15 when they hurried up the steps of the mess. Monroe had missed lunch and would make do with Spam sandwiches and a glass of lemonade. Not that there was any harm in having a glass of beer at lunchtime, even when they were on battle order, but he felt that he should be marginally more abstemious than his men. Sandy drank lemonade too. Monroe was a wealthy desiccated landowner with a fragile manner and little or no sense of humor. In 1941, he had been injured in the leg by flak. There were 3 or 4 splinters still hiding somewhere in his ankle. For a time, he had needed a walking stick, and even though he had stopped limping ages ago, he had never relinquished the walking stick. He marched around the aerodrome, brandishing it like a laird striding through the heather. He was a tall, slender man with a lined face and a stubby moustache. His closely trimmed hair was grey at the temples, and although most of the men flying that night would be wearing white roll-neck sweaters and stained battle dress, Monroe was never seen on duty in anything other than his well-tailored barathea with his handmade shoes polished like patent leather, like his civilian worsteds and tweeds. Monroe's uniforms had a patina that only years of valeting can bestow. The elbows and cuffs were reinforced with patches of soft brown leather, and there was a special pocket where he kept a box of Swan Vesta matches. He reached into it and carefully lit his pipe, even though it seemed to be burning well. Often at meetings and briefings, this gave him a moment's pause in the conversation. It was, like many of his mannerisms, an old man's habit. He was 35 years old, and yet few people would have guessed him to be younger than 45. This would not have surprised Wing Commander Monroe. He preferred to look 45. Monroe had been an officer since 1932, although he had spent a year of peacetime as a civilian. His wife, Sarah, was running the whole estate now. It was a beastly war for her, extra acres under cultivation, but many of the staff in the army. She was looking so much older. There was a letter waiting for him in the rack. It was written in bold, good-humoured handwriting on a sheet torn from an accounts book. Darling, how can I thank you for the magnificent handbag? It arrived on my birthday, which represented a brilliant piece of Monroe organization. I don't think I'd like to see London at the present time. From your description, it sounds like an international madhouse. I like the way you are always telling me to never trust strangers, and yet you are really absurdly generous with those unregenerate ruffians from the old squadron whenever you meet them, which usually means whenever you enter a public house. Perhaps you should grow a large moustache again at that. The beans are going to be magnificent. Aren't you clever? You must be here to taste the first of them. Those dashed aphids are all over the roses as usual, and they just drink up the spray, belch, and call for more. The strawberries are doing very well, and tomorrow I'm jam making with Cook. I'll send you a pot of it. Now you mustn't worry about us, but we both know that it will take a few years for Peter to build his strength up to that of other children, but he has fresh air, and there is plenty of milk here still. If he went to Canada, who would give him the love that we give him? And what is more important, you remember how short of breath he was when you were on leave at Christmas. Now he is just as bad again. It's pitiful to hear him at night, and I want to breathe for him. The darling, he's so good about it all, and Dr. Crawford says that it must be painful for him sometimes. We miss you, darling, but you must worry only about bringing yourself home to us, safe and well. Save your concerns for yourself and your men. Here all is well apart from Peter, and for him it's simply time and rest and fresh air. I would not have told you anything of this, but you made me promise. I will see you sometime soon. Take care, my darling. Do take care. From your untidy slut of a farmhouse wife and dung spreader-in-chief at 2 a.m. and the accounts not complete. Love, Sarah. That girl and her cheese sandwiches, said Monroe. Yes, sir, said Sandy, looking up and suddenly alert. Not a bad idea, that. Indeed, sir. Eating in the air. Monroe carefully folded the letter and replaced it in the envelope. He took a gold propelling pencil from his pocket and listed upon its back the things he must do before briefing time. In the cryptic style of Teleprinter Meldekopf 1, ILN Funkhorsch Regiment West, the Radio Monitoring and Interception Department of 12th Fliegerkorps HQ received from Palais, Luxembourg. Paris, HQ of the 3rd Air Fleet, the so-called WWII report. This was the collated result of hostile radio traffic. Navigational bomb and radar aids, IFF and jamming devices, largely. However, it was based upon the brief radio tests made by RAF wireless operators. Radio tests before lunch usually indicated a bomber being readied for a raid that evening. Jimmy Grimm's best bent wire signal was just one of the hundreds heard in Paris. The Luftwaffe's No. 1 Fighter Division HQ at Deelen was told unusually early to expect a heavy RAF attack that night. Fernschreiben plus KR 31.6.1943 Geheim Meldekopf 1 Funkbefehlsstand West Luftflotte 3 Ho NAFU GLTD H401 Jagd Division Funkbefehlsstand Mitte Wim Meldung RAF with approx 600-700, among them perhaps 92 motor, expected target West Germany Meldekopf Unbar B NR 356743 Gez Bofinger Elter. There were vehicles that every sentry at the Wald Hotel could recognize. For instance, the commanding officer's Mercedes, the Daily Mail and ration lorries, and the afternoon transport that went to the railway station. For these, the ornate hotel gates were folded back well before their arrival. At the approach of an unrecognized vehicle, however, it was customary to challenge it and scrutinize the driver's papers before the gates were opened. The muddy Kubelwagen did not decrease speed when the two SS sentries walked to the middle of the road. Mousy Scheske held up his hand but finally stood back behind the sentry box. It was to the credit of the other sentry that he did not jump aside until the last moment, when the front offside mudguard caught him a glancing blow on the leg. Damage to his kneecap resulted, some weeks later, in the removal of a cartilage. The motor stopped after striking and bending a spray of wrought iron oak leaves. Its mudguard suffered another dent. "Officer of the guard!" bawled the man in the front seat of the car, making no attempt to get out, nor sparing a glance for the sentry who had been knocked full length upon the gravel. Guard dogs barked, and 6 armed and equipped soldiers stumbled to be first out of the gatekeeper's lodge that was now used as a guard room. They were clamping their helmets to head and fixing bayonets, and all the time were treated to loud complaints from the officer. "Open the gates! Pick that fool up! Officer of the guard! Why aren't you saluting? Where's that man's pack? Officer of the guard! Move these clowns off the path. You know how long you lot will survive on the East Front? 24 hours. Why is that helmet dirty? Where in the name of bloody blue blazes is the officer of this pitiful shambles of a stumbling band of crippled incompetents? Officer of the guard!" He screamed as loud as possible, and the starlings in the nearby trees rose into the blue sky in alarm. No less alarmed were the Scheske boys, Mousy and Hannes, who for the first time were seeing a Knight's Cross winner, grimy with the dust of battle, here before their very wide eyes. "Yes, sir," said a young officer, still breathless. He'd heard the noise while lying on a bed in the guard-room with his boots off. Fischer yelled his own particulars like a recruit. Sturmbannführer Fischer from Panzergrenadier Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, on attachment to SS Division Hitler Jugend, Beverlo, Belgium. Give these kids and armchair soldiers the whole lot in the teeth. That was the only way to treat them. "Yes, sir," said the young officer. He took Fischer's travel papers. He'd heard that a new elite SS division was being formed. "That's the sort of unit I'd like to be assigned to." Quietly, he added, "A man forgets he is a soldier in these backwaters." "So I notice," said Fischer. He opened his leather overcoat to replace his papers, which the young officer of the guard had not examined. The Knight's Cross tinkled against his top button, and he saw the young man's eyes drawn to it. More than anything else, the young officer wanted that. A Knight's Cross holder could do no wrong. Headwaiters provided the best tables and hotels their best rooms. Queues vanished. Girls submitted, and even senior officers showed respect. How, he wondered, had this dirty fellow gained his? He looked at both of the men in the car. Each of them had a P-38 pistol in a leather holster strapped to his waist with a lanyard from its butt. On the VW's dashboard there was a machine pistol in metal clips. There was an oily rag around its bolt, and deep into the clumsy wooden stock of the gun the name Fischer had been carefully carved. So had a line of 28 notches. Fischer removed his peaked cap and wiped its sweaty leather band with a dirty handkerchief. His skull showed pink through the closely cropped hair. On it were the white, worm-like scars of childhood bumps and falls, and a long furrow that could only have been made by a bullet. He tucked the handkerchief into his sleeve as the English were reputed to do. The young guard commander noted this fine touch of sophistication. "I want petrol and a new set of plugs." Fisher rubbed his oil-blackened hands together briefly. "We've had trouble with the motor. And food, bathroom and bed?" "The motor first." "Immediately." "Herr Sturmbannführer," said the young officer. Now the sentries were alert and stiff with anxiety. That's all they needed, thought Fisher. A real soldier here to light a fire under them. The young officer's accent was that of a country boy, racially pure, outstandingly fit, and as ideologically sound as a dull-witted yokel could be. It all fitted Waffen-SS selection policy, but sometimes Fisher wondered if the policy was sound. "Your kit to your room," said the boy slowly, "and put a guard on it." "I'm carrying valuables." "Yes, sir. And feed my driver and give him a place to sleep. He hasn't closed his eyes for 56 hours. The young officer looked at the high-cheeked driver. "Are we taking Asiatics into the SS now?" "We have a whole division of them in training. 14th SS Freiwilligen Division Galician. 250 of them have gone to the Junkerschule. By the time you get to the east, they'll have Ritterkreuz dangling on their collars, and you'll be saluting them. Ostvolk. The Reichsführer says they are comrades. You don't object?" "No, sir, da," called the young man loudly. Fisher gave a sour smile. The gates were wide open. Fisher signalled with his finger that the driver should start up. The young officer said, "Follow the gravel drive. You'll see the old hotel building. I'll phone ahead so that they'll have orderlies to attend to your baggage. And I will phone the kitchen too." "You're getting the idea, boy," said Fisher, as the car rolled forward. He turned to his driver and, in careful German, said, "Petrol, sparking plugs, bath, food, sleep. It's now 1500. The Kübelwagen ready by 2200. He held up his fingers. "Frauen," said the driver. "No, Frauen, you big ape," said Fisher. "This is Germany. Wait until we are across the border." Half understanding, the Ukrainian smiled so that his narrow eyes almost closed. He nodded his head. The inhabitants of Altgarten wore the tired faces that years of war. Blackout, rationing, overtime and loneliness bring to the people that endure them. The uniforms were coarse and the civilian suits threadbare. The girls' dresses were homemade, although here and there in the crowd one saw fine furs or pearls that had made a journey in a soldier's kit bag. "What time do you leave?" asked Anna Louisa. She was giving his shoes an extra polish as she always did just before he returned to duty. 3 o'clock, answered Bach. "A staff car will take me. I'm impressed. An old friend, on the staff of General Christiansen. He has to go from Dortmund to The Hague several times a month. He often gives me a lift." "You shouldn't have told me. I want to tell you everything," he said. She packed clean laundry into his case, folding and smoothing it with a new-found dedication. Sometimes Oberst Max Sepp travelled in General Christiansen's Mercedes, complete with imperious horn and flying pennant. Today Bach was disappointed to find him in a Citroën. It was a factory-fresh car, specially made for the Wehrmacht and newly painted Luftwaffe blue, but it hardly compared with the Mercedes and its throaty roar and silver supercharger pipes. Even Max was less impressive than usual, hunched in a badly creased cape and battered peaked cap. As they stood on the pavement, August glanced into the sky. It was a habit he would never lose. 6 miles in the sky above him, the Met observation Spitfire pilot had seen the whole sweep of the cold front and its attendant hammerhead clouds and black twig-like base. He scribbled upon the notepad attached to his thigh, and while his attention was distracted from the controls, the aeroplane lost 500 feet of altitude. This brought it low enough for condensation trails to form, although only for a minute. At 420 mph, that minute meant a thin white scar 7 miles long across Krefeld's blue sky. "One of our fighters," said Max. August didn't reply. He threw his leather overcoat onto the driver's seat and got in. Max Sepp was a plump, white-haired man in his middle 50s. He was on the staff of the military governor of the Netherlands. He was controller of civilian fuel supplies, about which, as he freely admitted, he knew little or nothing. Before the war he had been a forestry official. "This is the life," said August, settling into the back of the car with Max as the driver closed the door and saluted. Anna Louisa waved and August waved back. The car moved off. "The best job in the war," said Max. "When I go on leave, I feel ashamed at the arduous life they lead on the home front." The driver had done this same journey 1,000 times. From Münchenstrasse, where Bach lived, he drove across Dorfstrasse, the big main street, and into Richterend, the shortcut round the back of St. Antonius Hospital. The old building was dwarfed by the new training centre behind it, while on their left, lines of unpainted huts on the waste ground stretched as far as Sackgasse and the slums behind the gasworks. "What's that bloody great place, Ben?" asked Max. "A concentration camp." August Bach looked at his friend a moment and glanced at the back of the driver's head before replying. "No," he said finally. "It's a medical centre for amputees. Men from the East Front and civilians from the bombed cities. They learn how to use false limbs there. They take a walk into Dorfstrasse and frighten the kids and look at the empty shops. Lovely. Is that what a concentration camp looks like?" "Max? If either of us knew that, my dear August, we would probably not say, probably wouldn't be sitting here," said August. "How right you are." Max Sepp smiled grimly. He looked out of the window as the car turned the corner at Frau Kirsten's fruit farm and jolted heavily over a badly repaired place in the road. "An air raid?" asked Max. "Altgarten's one and only. Last March, an RAF plane jettisoned incendiary bombs across the potato fields and 2 high-explosive bombs, one on the road, one on Frau Kirsten's outhouse. She has French prisoners of war working on the farm now. She made them fix up the barn and mend the road. They did a better job on the barn than on the road. She didn't give them the road to live in." "Smart woman. Frau Kirsten," said Max with a laugh. The car turned northwest onto the road that they would follow to Nierkerk and all the way to Arnhem. On the left, Frau Kirsten's potato fields stretched away to the flat horizon. Long lines of bent figures were lifting the waxy yellow potatoes that August liked so much. There were children among them, for the schools had given older boys the traditional holiday to help with the crop. As lines moved forward, their forks raised the dry soil so that the breeze carried it in dust clouds across the fields behind them. "They are fine potatoes," said August. "Ah, potatoes. How could the Wehrmacht fight without them? Frau Kirsten must be doing very nicely out of the war." August, a smart woman? Now that's a direction you might be looking. "What do you mean, Max?" August couldn't help laughing at the face Max pulled in answer to him. "What do you think I mean, you old rogue?" said Max. "You think I believe you spend all your time embracing your binoculars and flirting with those seagulls around that radar station of yours. Just lately the RAF have been keeping me busy. Not too busy for that. August, I'm in love. Max, I'm going to get married." "To the RAD girl?" "Yes. We have a lot of rad girls working in the military government. It never works out." "Whatever do you mean?" said August. "Marriages with the RAD girls' clerks. We have a couple of requests every month. I usually post the girl away, unless she's pregnant. In that case, I post the man. You're a cold-hearted swine." "Max, your girl? Whom is she?" "Damn you, Max, no. At least, there you are, August, face the truth. old friend, a moment's fun, a convenient relationship. He paused. For a time, not for a marriage. August. I love her, Max. See how it goes for a month or two. There's a war on, Max, and God knows how old I'll be when it ends. No, this is right for me and right for her too. Cigar? Thank you. August sniffed at it appreciatively. The controller of civilian fuel supplies, Netherlands, is a post that brings a privilege or two. All right, she's just a naive young girl, but I've had enough of complex, sophisticated people. If she'll put up with my devious complications, I'll be happy to have her simple soul. Max smiled and lit the cigar for him. For quite a long time they both looked out of the car windows without speaking. It was odd, thought August. One can know a man for many years, and then suddenly half a dozen sentences reveal how little communication there truly is between the two of you. Perhaps all human relationships are like that. Perhaps the best that he could hope for in a marriage to Anna Louisa was that disenchantment would come slowly, and the bitter aftermath of disenchantment, the black, despairing hatred, never even begin. He looked at Max. How indolent and comfortable he was. He leaned back. His eyes closed as they sped along the clear main road. "Our roads," remarked Max. "Could we have imagined such wonderful roads when we were children? Could we have imagined war on two fronts and the need to move armored divisions on interior lines? You're a miserable fellow today. Admit the Führer's roads are wonderful. The roads are wonderful, but are roads the thing we most urgently need? I can't help thinking that the great Autobahnen were built across the land in order to convince us that Germany is not a conglomeration of disparate and unfriendly principalities. Well, today I bless the fine roads, for we have a detour. Dielen, will it make us late? You won't miss your appointment with the Tommies. How late? 60 kilometers to Dielen. Dielen to your radar site can't be more than 150 kilometers, even after dropping me off in The Hague. How long at Dielen? Stop being so nervous. August. We'll have no local traffic in the border zone. A few convoys between Utrecht and The Hague, and then nothing at all in the prohibited coastal zone. When we get to Dielen, you'll be fascinated. I'll have to drag you away. You'll see. The first traffic hold-up was on the far side of Geldern. Teenage officer cadets, stripped to the waist and gleaming with sweat, were working like a chain gang to replace a damaged bridge section in record time. They were only a couple of kilometers past that when an oncoming convoy halted them again. August watched the 12-ton half-tracks and the 8.8 centimeter flak guns they trailed creep past. It was a large battery complete with fire control equipment and personnel in full battle order. 3 of the guns were crewed by Flakhelfer. These Hitler-Jugend, some only 15 years old, were dwarfed by the seats of the giant tractor. Their steel helmets came low over their unsmiling faces. They wore brightly coloured badges and shoulder patches and red and white swastika armbands. At their waists each one had a dagger. Hitler-Jugend volunteers, said Max. Conscripts, said August. Kids? That's it? How soon would Hansel be accoutred thus and fed into the endless war? Max counted the guns as they rolled past. 28 guns, exclaimed Max. Fantastic! Gross battery, under centralized fire control. At first it was 2 or 3 sites combining. Now they have up to 40 guns under one control. Is that good? At least the flak keeps the RAF up high. Without flak, the Tommies would come down on the deck and put their bombs into our factory chimneys. You know, August, my friend, there are quite a few homeless civilians living in the Ruhr who would prefer that. He laughed. A flak officer noticed the dark blue Citroën with its Luftwaffe number plates and came across to apologize for the delay. He was a stern-faced young man. Steel helmet, fair moustache, and a non-regulation pair of soft kid gloves that came into view as he saluted. "There are road repairs in Geldon," said Max Sepp. "You won't get these contraptions through the town." "I know, sir, ma'am," said the officer, "but we turn off to Wesel before the road works." "The road into the Ruhr from Wesel is even worse," said Max. "I know this district well." "Our destination is a house," said the flak officer. "Why our house?" said Max. "If it was left to me, I'd pull all the flak back into the Ruhr. There you can be sure of a crack at the terror flyers. You'll be lucky to see any Thomas at a house." "The policy is still an air defence corridor along the Netherlands border," said August. "My lads are keen," said the officer. "They'll be disappointed unless they see action soon," August replied. "No great dependence is to be placed in the eagerness of young soldiers for action. For fighting has something agreeable in the idea to those who are strangers to it." The flak officer was puzzled. He pulled at the fastening of his glove. "Vegetius," supplied August. "A Roman military writer of the 4th century," explained Max Sepp. "As the Herr Oberst wishes," said the officer respectfully. 3 huge searchlights trundled past them. He saluted again and swung aboard one of the slow-moving tractors to join his young enthusiasts. The Citroën moved forward. "You shocked the fellow," said Max. "I didn't mean to," said August. "Why worry?" said Max. "With that medal at your throat, you can afford to be blasé about heroism, but in case you should think me an untutored serf, Vegetius was also the man who said, 'Let him who desires peace prepare for war.'" "We all say something we don't mean once in a while," said August. Max laughed, and August wondered if he had not been too quick to judge his old friend. There was another 1/4 of a mile of the traffic jam before the cause of it was revealed. There, a Bedford Army lorry and an Opel car were locked in embrace. A young NSKK man was directing the traffic onto the grassy verge around the debris, while 3 other NSKK men were extricating the unconscious driver from under the lorry's bent steering column. The rear part of the Bedford had broken through a hedge, and from it boxes of fruit had fallen and split open. Pigs from the orchard were making the most of their good luck. "Those bloody British lorries," said Max. "They shouldn't allow them on the road, but after Dunkirk there were so many. With right-hand steering, half of these lorry drivers are motor course kids. They are taught to drive in 3 weeks and then they come on the road and kill anyone who gets in their way." The NSKK boy waved them forward and they bumped onto the grass. It was well ploughed up now and the Citroën's wheels were spinning for a moment before getting a grip. Max leaned out of the car as they passed the traffic man. "Those right-hand drives are death traps," he said. "I don't speak German," said the traffic man. "I am French." He had the same green and black uniform that the Germans had, but he wore a tricolour badge on his sleeve, and now he tapped it. Max was furious. "What bloody use are they?" he shouted loud enough for the boy to hear. August said, "We're short of manpower." "Max, Russia is drinking our population as fast as we can get them there." "A Frenchman," said Max angrily. "They are a logical race. They should make good traffic police." "Huh," said Max. "Logical. They put a knife between your ribs and spend an hour explaining the rational necessity for doing it. That sounds like a lot of Germans I know." "No. A German puts a knife into your ribs and weeps a sea of regretful tears." August smiled. "And after the Englishman has wielded the knife, he says, 'Knife. What knife?'" August laughed. From there on, apart from a traffic jam in Cleve and a long line of traffic crawling through a military police check at the Waal Bridge, they moved fast. August dozed off until Max nudged him. "We'll be at Deelen in 5 minutes or so," said Max. "Deelen Air Base or the Divisional Operations Room?" "Number 1 Fighter Division. They control the whole damned air battle there, the whole of the Netherlands, Westphalia, Rhineland-Palatinate, and even parts of Hesse and Belgium. Been there before?" "Last year." "Ah, yes. The old sanatorium buildings. Wait till you see the new bunker. When I first saw it, August, I realized for the first time that no matter what the armies and Tommies do, they can never win against organization like ours. On the control map, there is every night fighter, bomber, flak unit, civil defense unit. It's like magic.
We need every bit of magic we can get, Max. Last year, the RAF kept flying right through the bad winter weather. There was no chance for a breathing space. We must stop these people within the next few weeks, or we can be sure they'll keep bombing us right through next winter. What's the good of winning a war if our families, our homes, or our cities, our museums, and culture are bombed to destruction? We can move our Tiger tank factories deep underground, but we can't put Speyer Cathedral or Cologne underground. The experts at OKL say that if we can crack the morale of the bombers this year, they'll give up bombing the cities. The only way I know of cracking their morale is shooting them down. Well, of course, they say if we could bring their casualty averages up by just 2.5%, the RAF would have to change their tactics. Now you understand why I mustn't be late back, said August. A short summer night, like tonight. The moon almost full.
If they come tonight and we don't knock down a record number of them, we don't deserve to win. The Luftwaffe Citroën stopped at the first of the HQ's roadblocks. The Luftwaffe sentries with their submachine guns looked strangely out of place in the candy-striped sentry boxes. An elderly sentry checked their papers and waved the car on. It had rained heavily here, and the striped box made dazzling reflections on the shiny road. The bunker itself was in beautiful forest land south of the airfield. The tall beech trees were dripping onto the sunlit paths, and beyond the woodland patches of heather were near to flowering. They got out of the car. There was a smell of resin from the sun-baked pine trees, and also the damp, dark smell of mold. Deelen Airfield was only a stone's throw beyond the trees, and from there August caught the sound of a light aircraft. He waited until it came into view above the trees. It was a white two-seater biplane climbing steadily and earnestly without showmanship. "That's what I call an aeroplane," said August. "If only flying had stayed like that, instead of giving way to scientists, horsepower, calculating machines, and control systems. You mustn't complain about that." "My good August," said Max, "you are a controller. Remember." The white biplane banked and turned neatly. Its fabric was still wet with rain, and its wings flashed in the sunlight. The little plane kept climbing in spirals, like the diagrams in training manuals. Then, just as deliberately, it set course on a reciprocal of its takeoff path and passed over them again. Before they could turn away, the puttering of the white trainer was drowned by the roar of a twin-engine Junkers. The great black machine appeared over the leafy oak trees like some new sort of flying beetle. Its sting-like aerial array seemed to quiver as it searched for the other plane. In a moment, it had gone. "What a beauty," said Max. "For the time being, I'll take the calculating machines and horsepower every time." The bunker was truly gigantic. Its entrance road sloped down to a leveled site several meters below ground level. In spite of this, the bunker towered above the surrounding woodland. It was as high as an apartment building and as long as a city block. Its roof was 3 meters of concrete laced with steel rods and heavy steel girders. Every lesson learned in the first years of war had been embodied in its design. "It's indestructible, Webbo," said Max. "It will stand there for hundreds of years after the war is over. Even if you wanted to remove it, it would be impossible." Max was enjoying August's surprise. "Take no notice of all those windows in the wall," said Max. "That's just to give some light to the office workers. Behind that layer of offices, the concrete internal structure is many meters thick. The doors were 1 centimeter steel, hung on hinges as big as fists. The concrete corridors were noisy with Luftwaffe personnel. many of them young girls. Max Sepp knocked briefly upon an office door and marched into an office crowded with Luftwaffenhelferinnen, uniformed girl communication auxiliaries. Max was on first-name terms with them. He collected a metal document case and gave it to his driver to carry. Max settled down to gossip with one of the girl auxiliaries. From among the young officers who received Max's cigars, one elected to show August the opera house itself. He was a dark-eyed young man. He put the cigar away in his desk and reached for his cap. He had grown a blunt black moustache to imitate the one Dolfo Galland, the popular young general of fighters. War? August guessed he'd smoke his cigar in similar mimicry. With a seeming disregard for convention or discipline, he kept his left hand thrust deep into his jacket pocket in a rakish manner that well suited the night fighter clasp on his chest and German cross on his top pocket. The young lieutenant took August upstairs. The outer shell of corridors gave on to the inner chamber at 3 levels. At the top of the staircase they passed through another identity check by an armed sentry. The lieutenant said to August, "There is a drill on at present, pheasant alert, so we must keep very quiet." As they entered the cool, dark battle room, August shook his head in disbelief. The lieutenant smiled. Every visitor was amazed. It had become a showplace for top Nazi VIPs, and this was the place to stand for a first glimpse. As August's eyes became accustomed to the gloom, he saw that it was indeed like an opera house. Seated rank upon rank in front of them were Helferinnen, each one crisp and neat in her white uniform blouse. He saw only the backs of their heads, as would a person standing at the rear of a steep theatre balcony. Far below him, in the orchestra stalls, were rows of high-ranking control officers. Everyone's attention was upon the stage. For hanging where a theatre's curtain would hang, there was a glass map of Northern Europe. The green glass map was 15 meters wide, and its glow provided enough light for August to see the rows of white faces peering at it, and the papers on their desks. On the walls beside the map there were weather charts and a complex board that showed the availability of reserve night fighters, the cool air. Silent movement and green light conspired to make the atmosphere curiously like that of an aquarium. Each of the girls in the balcony with them had a spotlight. From the Fresnelled lens of each one was beamed a small white T to represent a constantly moving RAF bomber, or a green T to represent the fighter hunting it. As the map references came over the girls' headsets, they moved the white bombers across Holland and northern Germany in a neat line. Down in the stalls, the phones were in constant use and there was a shuffle of papers and movement. The air conditioning made a loud humming sound, and it was cool enough inside this vast concrete bunker to make August shiver even on this warm summer's day. From here, phone and teleprinter cables stretched across the land to airfields, watchtowers, radar stations, radio monitors and civil defense headquarters, even U-boats, and flagships off the Dutch coast. Reported aircraft movements to this bunker, which the Luftwaffe had christened the Battle Opera House. Overlapping circles of light had appeared on the map. Each one was a radar station like August's own. Each one had 2 night fighters circling above it, waiting to pounce upon a bomber coming into range of its magic eye. Now and again one of the T-lights was switched off as a bomber was destroyed. The young lieutenant had noticed August's pour le mérite and decided that he was worth a fuller explanation than most of the rubberneck visitors that he showed around. He pointed to the 6 rows of stalls far below them. It's in the 2 front rows that the battle decisions are made. The Major General Third, from the left, is the divisional controller. On each side of him he keeps an EA, operations officer. On the far left is the NFU, or chief signals officer. Second to the right of the div controller, the officer with the yellow tabs, is the I, or intelligence officer. The old man on his right is the senior meteorology man. The second row of officers, the ones speaking into phones all the time, are fighter controllers carrying out the orders. On that same desk there's a flak officer, radar controller, and civil defense liaison. "Who is the man in the tinted glass office on the left?" asked August. "Radio Intelligence Liaison Officer. He only comes out to talk with the divisional controller. Even then it's in a whisper." He smiled. He had the cynical attitude to boffins that operational pilots always have. The T-shaped lights moved slowly in a straight line towards Berlin. "What do you think?" asked the lieutenant. "It's damned impressive," said August. "It's not always as calm as this. I'm afraid. On a real raid, things get more hectic. I've seen them shouting at each other down there, and those little white lights don't disappear so quickly," said August. "Ah," said the lieutenant, "that's the real difference. I'm afraid." He spoke like a man who knew how big the sky was on a dark night. They watched the air raid proceed for a few more minutes. Still, the white T-lights that represented the bombers kept on their narrow line. The controllers practiced dealing with the stream tactics that the RAF had developed as a way of overwhelming the radar defenses of just one zone instead of presenting single targets piecemeal to several radar sets and accompanying night fighters. What about the Mosquito they send in to mark the target? If our planes could get up high enough to knock that down, the stream wouldn't know where to drop their bombs. "Exactly," said the lieutenant. He swung lightly round on his toes with his arms stiffly akimbo, giving him a curious, effeminate stance. He eyed Bach speculatively and then decided to confide a secret. "Tonight, we have a surprise awaiting them. The Ju-88's supercharged with nitrous oxide. Ha ha ha, they call them, laughing gas. You see, you've heard about them, eh? What idiot thought of that code name? And 12.8 guns on railway mountings. We are going to try everything we know tonight. I don't know, some fool in Air Ministry, I suppose."
"If they cooperate by flying over the railway guns," said August doubtfully, "they always come in from north to south, and always towards the Ruhr because
"We think that's the limit of the electronic range. So we can make a guess at it. We'll be more or less in position." "Radio intercept predict a big one tonight," said August. He looked at his own radar station on the glass map. Its range indicated by a dull-lit circle. It was exactly placed between the RAF bomber airfields of East Anglia and the Ruhr. "I'm at Ermin," said August. "I know, sir," said the lieutenant. "I don't think you'll have much sleep before morning." Now August could see that the young lieutenant's stiff left arm was artificial. Chapter 11. Like all such depressions, this one had been born when moist air from the Azores met the cold, dry air of the Arctic. The resulting muddled air mass moved eastwards over Britain until it reached the sea area to the west of Denmark, which was called Heligoland. Here the centre of the depression paused. Hinged upon this depression, the cloud-marked cold front, like a 1,000-mile-wide door. Swung across Europe at 20 miles an hour, the front curved because its southern edge couldn't keep up the pace. That southern end had only reached Bilbao in Spain when the centre was darkening the skies of Lyon and the northern sector was deluging the streets of Esbjerg with torrential rain. In the high-pressure region that followed the front, the heavy air subsided, warming by compression as it dropped. There was no more than the lightest of breezes. The clouds shrank even as you watched them, and the sun shone. England had had its thunderstorms during the night and a morning of sunshine, but already a little cumulus had appeared over Wales and parts of the West Country. At Kroonsdijk, however, where the cold front had only recently passed, the skies were blue and the sun warmed the wet grass. Unteroffizier Himmel eased himself into the pilot's seat of his Ju-88, parked at the end of the dispersal. The sun had been upon the metal fuselage for several hours, and now the seat and controls were hot to touch, and the smell of warmed fuel was as powerful as Glühwein. It was a luxury to be alone for a moment, and apart from the sounds of the ground crewmen doing their pre-flight inspection, it was as peaceful as a country graveyard. Himmel looked at the wet grass where an oil patch made a rainbow pattern of red, yellow and mauve. A sandpiper landed and bobbed around the brightly coloured grass looking for worms until a mechanic closed the dinghy stowage hatch forcibly enough to frighten it back into the air. The old piece of fuselage that the fire section had set alight sent a quill of white smoke into the still air. At its nib, Lieutenant Beer in overalls was wielding a fire extinguisher under the command of Horst Knoll, the senior NCO of the fire section. Horst was a bad-tempered fellow who hated officers and did his best to make their lives as uncomfortable as his legitimate duties permitted. "On to the base of the flame," he was shouting to Beer, who was reluctantly closing in upon the foul-smelling wreckage and cursing. Horst Knoll, knowing exactly what the moving lips were saying, smiled and urged him forward all the more. "Don't be afraid of the smoke, Herr Leutnant. Get much closer and put the jet on to the base of the flame. Much closer. Herr Leutnant! Much, much closer." At the far end of the line of matte black aircraft, Major Radenbacher's aeroplane poked its snout from the dark hangar. Most of the spare mechanics were working on it. Suddenly the peace was shattered by the sound of engines. A Junkers with Lieutenant Cocker at the controls was also preparing for an air test. Its chocks were pulled aside. Cocker gave a blip of throttle to start it moving around the perimeter. It moved away beyond the alert hut where the aircrew spent so much time. Outside it, a dozen aircrew, air tests completed, sat sunning themselves. Most of them were younger than Himmel, and few had been in the Luftwaffe as long as he had, but they'd come from all manner of units as their clothing showed. They'd seen service on war fronts from Finland to Egypt, British Army bush shirts, Czech flying boots, old Hitler Jugend shorts, and Swedish leather jackets. Some sat shirtless, eyes closed in the deck chairs. Two played chess, and some sprawled full length on the wet grass, arguing about engines and firepower and girls and promotion and medals. No matter how much Löwenherz disapproved of their unsoldierly appearance, it was a standing order of Major Radenbacher that at their alert huts the aircrews could dress informally, always providing that the regulations concerning the wearing of identity tags around the neck are not disobeyed. 3 flyers were standing in the hut doorway. Himmel looked at his watch and guessed that they were listening to the BBC, for this was the time that they broadcast the Flyers program. The carefully written technical talks always ended with a list of Luftwaffe personnel newly captured and newly dead. Suddenly there was a loud thunder of cannon fire, and they all swung round to the firing butts. Above it, a thin veil of blue smoke showed where Löwenherz's plane was having its guns harmonized by the armorers. Someone made a joke, and then Himmel saw them all laugh and relax. It was the long wait for nightfall that built up the tension. That's why Himmel always left his air test as late as possible. One of Himmel's ground crew removed the rudder lock and then walked round the aeroplane to check the ailerons and control surfaces. Himmel slipped his toes under the rudder bar loops and fastened his seat straps. He ran his hand down his oxygen lid connection to check it, and then moved the control column forward and back and twisted the antlers to be sure that the controls were free of obstruction. Old Krugelheim, the chief mechanic, was getting a little impatient. Under his black overalls he was shirtless and without trousers, but still he sweated as he paced about under the nose of Himmel's machine. He kept looking across to the hangar and Major Radenbacher's aircraft. The cowling had been removed from its port motor and its most intimate parts bared to the oily, inquiring hands of the fitters. The black-garbed men stood on a platform, arrayed around the disemboweled motor like witch doctors at a black mass. One of them, chanting a line from a textbook, bent low into its entrails and flashed a torch deep inside. His open hand appeared, and wordlessly a spanner was put into it. Krugelheim looked up to where Himmel sat in the cockpit, high above him. "The fuel pump," explained Krugelheim. Himmel hoped sincerely that the black men would work their healing magic soon, for it was 15-20 hours already, and if his own plane was not in service by nightfall, when the killing began, The Major had a habit of taking the nearest one. Himmel's plane, Cat's 4, was the nearest. He slid the cockpit fully open and called down to the chief mechanic. "Have you seen Unteroffizier Pohl?" "No," said old Krugelheim. "He's probably still talking to the signals officer." "These aerials are a trial to us," said Christian Himmel. The old man walked under the nose to look closely at the toasting fork. "It's the rain," he said. "If they stay dry for a few days, they work perfectly. Here comes Pohl now." Someone in flying overalls, yellow life jacket and parachute harness emerged from the hut, but it wasn't Himmel's radar operator. For a few paces he was obscured by the tail of another Junkers 88, but as he came round it, they recognized Löwenherz. On this warm day, none of the other flyers were wearing flying overalls. Like Himmel, most wore lightweight helmets, shirts, shorts and life jackets. It was just like Löwenherz to be in full flying gear. "What does the bloody Staffelkapitän want?" said old Krugelheim, as if having a faulty fuel line on Major Radenbacher's machine wasn't enough trouble for one day. "Cheer up, Kugel," said Himmel. "We'll soon find out." To call the grumpy old Oberfeldwebel Kugel was a privilege earned by only the most seasoned of Kroonsdijk's NCOs, although it meant bullet. The pot-bellied old chief mechanic was short enough in stature to realize that it also meant globe. Kugel came close under the cockpit. "You were in his Staffel during the Kanalkampf, weren't you, young Himmel?" "He was in mine. I took him on his first operational sortie as my wingman. He was a lively fellow in those days." "Then the war has sobered him," said the old man. "It's sobered a lot of us," agreed Himmel. "Agreed."
"Huh," exclaimed the mechanic bitterly. Himmel smiled at the old Oberfeldwebel. His misanthropy was what kept these aeroplanes in such good order. The old man too had been a lively youngster once, but there are more casualties of war than the doctor ever sees. Kugel clicked his heels as Löwenherz walked past him without a word and proceeded to inspect and waggle each control surface to be sure they were unlocked and free of obstruction. Himmel looked down to the hatch as Löwenherz climbed up the metal ladder. The soft inner hatch opened and his head appeared level with the floor of the cockpit behind Himmel's feet. "I'm flying with you instead of Pohl," he said. One of the ground staff passed Löwenherz's briefcase up through the hatch. Himmel nodded and turned to exchange a pained glance with the chief mechanic below, while Löwenherz strapped himself into the radar operator's seat behind him.
The backs of their heads almost touched, but between their seats there was a slab of steel armor. The Staffelkapitän carefully made sure that his intercom cable went down his back and was clipped to his overall. It was an inconvenience, but Löwenherz had read of several cases of aircrew being strangled by their own radio leads, and it was a pet subject for his memos. Himmel hoped that he wouldn't notice that his leads were not correctly positioned. "All set, Christian?" fussed Kugel. "It's warm today. Radiator gills full out while you're taxiing, then fully closed for takeoff. Watch the cooling indicator." Himmel nodded. "Fry!" yelled Kugel. "Fry!" replied Himmel, and pushed the button. The starter motor whined, jerking the blades. A bright blue flame escaped from the exhaust. In spite of the dampers, then there was an ear-splitting roar. The panel vibrated and the instruments blurred. Himmel throttled back. He started the other motor and waited while the fuel and oil pressure needles came alive. The whole plane was rocking on its tires now. He slid the side window closed in spite of the heat, for it was one of Löwenherz's well-known instructions. The instrument panel and the windscreen chattered with the pulse of the motors. He pushed the throttles wide open and saw the rev counters flick around to 2,800. Even through his flying helmet, the sound was piercing. The ground crew had hands clamped against their ears, and their black overalls rippled in the wind. Two of them tugged the chocks away from the wheels. Himmel took an extra look round the cockpit. Flaps up, Mags off, undercarriage locked, fuel full, straps fastened, oxygen ready. Brakes on. The instruments were color-coded, yellow for fuel, brown for oil, and blue for air. Each of them read correctly, and yet still, Himmel worried. All pilots did. This was the moment of worry. Once they were airborne, the tenseness would ease a little. Himmel hooked his oxygen mask into the forehead of his helmet and pushed closed the studs of his throat mic. Löwenherz, taller than Little Pole, struggled to notch the seat back. Himmel was about to help, but decided that Löwenherz was not the sort of man who liked being helped. "Pilot to radar operator," said Himmel, self-consciously. "All correct?" "All correct," said Löwenherz. In his rear-view mirror, Himmel saw Löwenherz fingering the radar controls. "Katze 4 to control. Request permission to take off." The controller told them to move off. Himmel released the brakes, and the aeroplane rolled forward. Old Kugel waved him away like a swarm of flies. Control told him to taxi to the far side of the airfield. Wait until Katze 2 was airborne, and then move on to the end of the runway. He moved slowly along the perimeter track and past a wrecked Junkers 34. It had been there ever since Himmel could remember and had become a landmark for the aerodrome. 3 months before, a salvage gang had removed the motor, only to find that it was an ancient Bristol Jupiter instead of the German power unit they had expected. A typical Luftwaffe balls up, thought Himmel. So now the disemboweled plane had its rusting motor displayed alongside like a museum exhibit. Parallel with the fence was the water-filled ditch, bright green now that summer sun had covered the surface with tiny cress plants. The dike itself was 2.5 meters higher than the aerodrome, and upon it was the road to Utrecht. Its edges were neatly marked in white paint, and its surface cobbled with the large stones that the Dutch call children's heads. Military convoys buzzed upon it like angry bees, and the wooden wheels of local cyclists crawled along with a bone-shaking clatter. Along the dike road came a company of metal-shod infantry. Himmel noticed the tired, sweaty soldiers look his way with envy as they trudged past under the weight of full packs, blankets and rifles. They were singing, "In der Heimat, in der Heimat, da gibt's ein Wiedersehen. In the homeland we'll meet again." Himmel and Löwenherz watched Cocker's plane as he ran its engines to maximum revs and then roared along the runway, climbing steadily towards the east. Then Himmel followed. It wasn't one of his best takeoffs, but to have Löwenherz sitting calmly behind you, waiting to do the routine radar interception test that was really the duty of meek little Unteroffizier Pole, was downright disconcerting. The land flashed past beneath them. The sun shone down upon Kroonsdijk, so that half of each street went black with shadow. Children pointed at them, a dog fled, a horse needed comforting, gulls went into the air like a handful of white confetti, caught the breeze and in unison swooped back towards earth. The undercarriage thumped into the nacelle, a line of laundry wriggled. Cyclists stopped. A silk patch of blue lake was tacked to green countryside by the taut fishing lines of 100 anglers hoping to supplement their meagre rations. The flat heathland was like purplish-brown sandpaper scratched with irregular pale footpaths. The fields and lakes grew smaller as they fell away. An empty road grew busy. Reached a fishing village and ended, boats crammed tight to crowded quays. Then there was just the empty blue water of the IJsselmeer. Over it there was a haze of summer heat, like smoking fat on a frying pan. Control called him. Katze 4 steer, 090 for practice air interceptions, rendezvous at 2,000 meters. Grid reference, Heinz, Marie 9. Himmel pulled a map from his flying boot. "Dielen," supplied Löwenherz before he could unfold it. Himmel spread the map and glanced down at the 9th square of the H&M reference. Of course, Löwenherz was right. Himmel smiled. The big plane was flying perfectly. In the mirror, he saw Löwenherz look over his shoulder. "Is this gun loaded?" asked Löwenherz. "Yes, sir. I'll test it while we are over water," announced Löwenherz. Behind him, he heard a burst of firing as he tested the gun. What a good thing the ground crew had loaded it. They often didn't bother, for in the night fighters wore these little machine guns, swiveled round by the radar man. Weren't much use. Himmel could smell the sour cordite fumes and tightened the oxygen mask against his face. They were circling Dielen when their airfield control called them to say that Kokker's Junkers had returned to Kroonsdijk with a technical fault. Leeuwarden Airfield would supply an aircraft for them to test the airborne radar. They must go to Ameland, an island off the northern coast of the Netherlands. It was Löwenherz who first saw the plane below them. It was only when you saw another aircraft in the sky that you realized how fast you were moving. It was a white biplane, an Arado 66 with a red warning streamer flying from its wingtip. It seemed a long time since Löwenherz had flown his first solo. "See that, Himmel?" said Löwenherz. "Below to port." The little trainer crawled across fields of ripening rye and dark fir woods. "He's going well, sir. Steadier than I was." "And steadier than I was too," agreed Löwenherz. "Come round behind him. Perhaps I can pick him up on the radar." "He's very low." "I think we'll get ground echoes," said Himmel. But he put the plane's nose down and came round to creep up behind the pretty machine that was popping along merrily like a toy. "I'll put the courier dead ahead," said Himmel, using the code word for enemy aircraft. The little white biplane had become an enemy bomber. For in what magical rites and rituals do we not manufacture an enemy from clay or wax, or even from wood and fabric? The doll that looks like your enemy is called by his name. Stick pins into it and set it alight and believe that those same misfortunes will befall the ones you hate. Pretending it was dark. The two men acted out their game, stalking after the white quarry with all the skill that their years of war had taught them. Himmel's head twisted and turned like an anxious sparrow's. Veteran fighter pilots survived by scrutinizing every sector of the sky regularly, and Himmel never rested his eyes on one thing for more than a moment. Victor Löwenherz, on the other hand, with some effort of willpower, concentrated solely upon working the radar. As far as he was concerned, the plane was under Himmel's control. His father had always boasted that he could ride better, shoot better, and even groom the horses and polish the equipment better than any man under his command. Similarly, Oberleutnant Löwenherz was proud of his skill on the radar sets. Of course, it was all very simple when your pilot was steering at the machine ahead for a test. In the black of night, when the pilot relied solely upon his radar man's guidance, it was very different. He adjusted the controls again, but the elevation tube was a mess, and the range tube was almost as bad. It was closing far too fast. Himmel throttled back and even used some flap, but the old biplane was so slow that Himmel had to break away to port and come round behind him again. In his mirror, Himmel saw Löwenherz crouching close to the 3 radar screens. He said, "You're right, Himmel. The ground echo at this height just wipes out the elevation blip. We're probably scaring the fellow half to death." "And scaring me too," thought Himmel. "Here we are. Perhaps the 2 most responsible and experienced pilots on the Staffel, compiling a blueprint for an air disaster, low altitude, speed close to stalling and formating on a strange aircraft. An accident investigation board would pillory both of us, should anything happen." Himmel rolled the little control wheel to close the flaps. He pushed the yellow throttle knobs and the engine note modulated from baritone to tenor. It was a relief to open up the motors. The Richards were powerful machines, but the heavy radar equipment and clumsy aerial array on the nose made them only too easy to stall. He made a wide arc round the little white biplane so that it wouldn't be thrown around by the prop wash. Himmel smiled as they passed. For the pilot had been so closely concerned with holding his horizon steady that he noticed the junkers now for the first time. He stared in amazement at the huge black machine and its secret radar aerials. Then the white biplane dipped as the pupil began looking for his airfield. The junkers climbed steeply and continued north, skirting Leeuwarden to the west and continuing out to sea. To starboard lay Terschelling, one of the largest islands in the Frisian chain. The weather was excellent except on the far northeastern horizon, where ice crystals of cumulonimbus clouds reached miles into the air and wore the dark skirt of falling rain. They continued over the Frisian Islands and out into the North Sea. Flecks of cloud made shadows on the water below them, and sometimes there were shreds of white stratocumulus large enough to swallow the plane for a moment. A few miles out they saw a coastal convoy, keeping well clear of the wrecks that litter this coast, but inside the minefields that protected it, the convoy was making good progress through the calm sea. The junkers was low enough to see the seamen moving on the decks, and some of the old coal burners were making columns of smoke tall enough to reach them. They were a battered collection, half-painted funnels, rusty winches, dribbling scuppers and misplaced hatch covers. Some of the deck cargoes were only half covered, and a deck party was working feverishly on the tarpaulins. Himmel wondered why they bothered. The grimy condition of the coasters was belied by the fresh rain that had glossed their decks and given their hulls the polish of old jackboots. 2 freighters had deck cargoes of honey-coloured fresh timber, looking good enough to eat. There were Danes and Dutchmen, ancient coastal tankers low in the water, and at the front 2 French cargo liners making down the coast with machinery and chemicals. They were sailing the routes they had always sailed, some since before the First War. Strange that now they should have German naval destroyers, frigates and UJ boats fussing around their formations, and German aircraft protecting them from the determined attacks of RAF planes. Stranger still when some of those RAF planes were manned by Frenchmen, Dutchmen and Danes. 2 UJ boats, converted trawlers of about 400 tons, detached themselves from the convoy and hurried to the rear. Now the convoy began changing course, but kept convoy discipline and good formation. Each wake was scratched crisp and white upon the azure ocean. It was a beautiful sight, enhanced by the red and yellow lights that climbed higher than the masts. The light cruiser was covered in winking lights, as though every seaman aboard was sending a message to the plane, as indeed he was. Suddenly there was an explosion. "They're firing at us!" yelled Löwenherz, but his voice was drowned by the fierce bangs of the shells bursting around them. Now Himmel knew what was under the tarpaulins. Guns. A near miss rocked the aeroplane and wrenched the port wing upwards. He didn't correct. He let the aeroplane skid down in a violent side slip. Each exploding shell hung a new black smudge in the sky, but the old smoke did not disappear. It slowly turned brown, and the air around them was blotched with smelly smoke like a 3-dimensional disease. The plane dropped through the bursting shells until the extra lift of the down-pointing wing and the junker's lateral stability flattened it into straight and level flight just 100 feet over the wave tops. Now they were within range of the flagship's 3.7-centimeter guns, and even the multiple 2 centimeters, the pom-poms added a new descant to the bass rhythms of the heavies. Himmel let down even lower until they were only 10 feet above the water. The sea was a different color close to, a cold, steely gray, flecked with dirty spume. Broken timber and refuse pockmarked its heaving surface, and so did the splashes of flak shells. Himmel moved the throttles forward and, with touches of rudder, danced across the wave tops low enough for spray to mottle the windscreen. The ship's gunners were aiming off skillfully. Their yellow lights spanned the water to make a fairy bridge between aeroplane and convoy. Soon they were far enough away for the bridge to fall into the water behind them. Himmel reset the trim wheel and pulled the nose up into a gentle climb. Ahead was Holland. Marking its coastline high in the air, there was another land of cumulus conjured up by the sea breeze from a cloudless sky. Himmel kept the junker's nose up. By the time they reached the coast, they would be above those clouds. How beautiful they were! Dark grey undersides, golden rims and fluffy white tops, with occasional gaps revealing intense blue sky above. "Are you all right, sir?" asked Himmel. "I'm fine. Is the aircraft functioning?" "It took a couple of knocks, but the controls are working." "That was damned remarkable flak." "Himmel, they get a lot of practice." "They get trigger-happy too," said Löwenherz. They both laughed too much, and the tension was relieved. "Do you remember that fellow they called Porky?" asked Löwenherz. "Ostend, in May 1941, when Karl Reinhold phoned him at the alert hut and told him he'd been awarded the Knight's Cross for low-level attacks against friendly shipping," hooted Löwenherz. "Then he phoned me. But luckily you'd warned me that they would play pranks upon the new boys." "They always did. You saved me being made a fool of. Christian, you were a good wingman, and now I'm your Staffelkapitän. It's funny how things work out." "You should be the Commodore," said Christian Himmel. "For God's sake, Christian, why did you take those documents? Is that why the Herr Oberleutnant came along?" Himmel had moved into the respectful third person. "Of course it is. Christian, it was a matter of honor. Herr Oberleutnant, honor? Those documents shame us all."
"Me? What are you saying? What sort of documents were they? They didn't tell you, eh? Well, perhaps they were ashamed." "Even shame is progress." Himmel reached into his flying overalls and pulled out a bulky document with brown paper covers. He passed it over his shoulder to Löwenherz. "Read it first, Herr Oberleutnant. Then you'll see why I have to go through with this."
It was not an impressive-looking dossier. There was a metal clip holding it together and a Luftwaffe eagle rubber-stamped onto the cover. Along the top it said, "Luftwaffe High Command, Medical Corps, Secret." It wasn't a printed document. It was a duplicated typescript, and in places the words were scarcely legible. "Go through with what?" "Please read it, sir." At first Löwenherz was inclined to return it to Himmel unopened. He feared he was being drawn into a tacit conspiracy. For some time he stared out from the cramped little pulpit and watched the green sea creep past. By the time they crossed the coastline, the cumulus fractus was below them, but only by an arm's reach. It stretched before them like a blinding white wasteland of ice and snow. The motors held a bass note like an organ pipe, and the plane trembled with its power. Oberleutnant Löwenherz made his decision. He undid the metal clip and began reading the stolen medical report. The convoy resumed the proper course after its evasive zigzagging. The destroyers and other armed ships hurried up and down, chivying the merchantmen into line with loudhailers and signal lamps. At the rear, the light cruiser Held maintained a dignified straight course like a mother hen. The Held had been the 3,500-ton light cruiser Jan Koppelstock of the Royal Netherlands Navy until 1940, when she was seized by the Germans and refitted as an anti-aircraft ship. In the forecastle battery, hidden by the steel door, a gunner named Franz Paulak was smoking a cheroot. His loader cleaned the breech of the 10. Weiss attempted to model 37 with care and affection. They were both wearing the hooded, fur-lined winter clothing that had been designed for the Russian front. It gave them some protection against the piercing North Sea winds that even in the middle of summer chilled professional sailors to the bone. The gun crews suffered even more, for many of them were ex-Luftwaffe personnel, most of whom found it hard to adapt to the rigors of a seaman's life. Obergefreiter Franz Paulak did. He had joined the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain, when cinema newsreels showed pilots relaxing in deck chairs between jousting amid puffy white clouds, yelling "Spitfire" and smiling in the sunlight as high-ranking leaders shook their hands firmly and garlanded them with medals. Franz had been washed out of pilot school after a very bumpy solo landing. His marks in navigation theory had precluded his transfer to observer school, and by the time he arrived as an officer candidate for the flak service, he was confused and demoralized. He flunked, and was now an Obergefreiter on a flagship with precious little chance of becoming anything better. Franz loathed all aeroplanes with a terrible and sustained hatred. The previous month, he and his gun crew had been credited with an RAF Blenheim bomber shot down. The gun barrel wore a white ring to celebrate it. Franz wanted to add another ring, only a little less than he wanted to become a civilian again. His K3, a plump butcher's delivery boy from Königsberg, was flushed with the exertion of loading 15-kilo shells onto the awkward, steeply inclined loading tray. He was arguing with Franz. "You can't paint a white ring on the barrel until the destruction of the plane is confirmed. That's the captain's orders. You saw it come down," said Franz. "Now am I the best gunner in the whole damn convoy? It may have dived to sea level to avoid the gunfire, but Admiral." Both his friends and his enemies called Franz Paulak Admiral. "Get the white paint. We shot it down. I tell you, I still say it might have been one of ours. What are you talking about?" "Klaus, every gun in the convoy was firing," said Franz. "They didn't start until you did," said Klaus. "Exactly. When I started." Old Glass Nose gave the order. "I'm still frightened. It might have been one of ours. It looked very like a Junkers 88 and it flew south to escape. Bowfighter. A Bristol Bowfighter, but anyway, it was an aeroplane," said Franz. "Aeroplanes drop bombs, and any aeroplane that comes within range of this contraption gets shot at. Now will you get the white paint?" "Whatever you say, Admiral." "We'll be the only gun on the Held with 2 victory rings, providing the old man doesn't make us paint it out again." "I tell you something, Dicker," said Franz, prodding his friend in the belly. "We're averaging 8.5 knots, and if that damn Danish bucket doesn't have any more steering gear trouble, we'll be sailing past the Hook of Holland by midnight. That's the place for aeroplanes. The RAF are over there nearly every night lately." He stroked the barrel of the big gun. "By tomorrow morning, Heine, we might have 3 rings on our Würstchen. Now wouldn't that be something to write to your cousin Sylvia about?" Klaus Munter looked at his friend and smiled, but if there was anything he hated more than to be called fatty, it was to be called Heine. "By tonight, the war might be over," said Munter. "It won't be over for me," said Paulak. In this, as in so much of his plausible patter, he was wrong. What Löwenherz had before him was one of the most bizarre, macabre and horrifying documents produced by a civilized society. Freezing experiments with human beings was a 32-page report drawn up by Dr. Sigmund Rascher of the Luftwaffe Medical Corps, helped by a professor of medicine at the University of Kiel. The experiments took place at Dachau concentration camp and consisted of putting naked prisoners into ice water or leaving them out in the snow until they froze to death. Their temperatures were taken from time to time and recorded by the doctors. After death, there was an autopsy. Dr. Sigmund Rascher had moved the Luftwaffe's decompression chamber from Munich to Dachau concentration camp a few kilometers down the road. 200 prisoners were put into this chamber and each was depressurized until his body exploded. The report on this series of experiments was sent to the medical inspector of the Luftwaffe in the summer of 1942. The third and final part of the stolen file was a report of Dr. Rascher's warming experiments. These were even more perverted. Male prisoners were frozen almost to death in ice water and then placed in a bed between 2 naked women. The women were prisoners from Ravensbrück concentration camp. Dr. Rascher noted in great detail the sexual reactions of the half-dead men and to what extent these improved their chance of survival. He reported in a paper dated February 1943 and marked secret. It stabbed Löwenherz to the heart of his belief. Of course he had misgivings. Few men didn't. Baron Löwenherz, his father, had not disbelieved the rumors. He called them symptoms of unrest. The Nazi Party was a bridge to sanity, a stage between the 1918 breakdown on the home front and the return to a natural state of things where a strong German officer corps held Germany's honor in trust. For the time being, the nation was in the hands of these Bavarians, and among them there were some villainous rascals. But better this sort of revolutionary than the Bolshevik variety, who was prepared to butcher families because their hands were clean or their names patrician. Inventive, creative men are inclined to be ruthless, the Baron had told him. We must work with these Nazi condottieri, just as Leonardo had to work with Machiavelli, with Cesare Borgia, and with his Count Sforza. Just as 3 centuries later the Industrial Revolution pushed aside philosophers and humanitarians so that single-minded despots ruled Europe. They put children up chimneys and women down mines. They bullied, cheated, bribed, and literally worked their employees to death. They caused misery and strife, but, as we now know, the Industrial Revolution put Europe a century ahead of the rest of the world. Now the Nazis are transforming Germany with a similar single-minded ruthlessness. Of course, we can't approve of the sort of things that occur. These camps that people speak of in whispers, the witch hunts for Jews and communists, or the gunboat diplomacy that Hitler used to annex Austria and then Czechoslovakia. Now, these things are bad things, but they're all things that Britain did, or would have done if necessary, to achieve its position as a world power. If Hitler cheats, he cheats for Germany. If he steals for Germany. If he kills, then this he does for Germany too. If he needs our help, then the officer corps must give it generously and unstintingly. All these things that his father had told him, Löwenherz explained to Christian Himmel. But Christian remained unconvinced. But what would you achieve if you gave these unpleasant documents to the British? Would you like their propaganda people to reveal such things to the world? I? Give them to the British? Said Himmel. Is that what they told you? Then what do you want with the papers? It's very simple, said Himmel. These things are being done in our name, Herr Oberleutnant. Oh, it sounds very grand when you say it's for Germany, but these things are being done on behalf of us aviators. The research will be used to help us survive should we force land in the ocean or the Arctic. But, Herr Oberleutnant, do you know a flyer who wouldn't sooner die than have these disgusting experiments done to prisoners? None, agreed Löwenherz. But that's because we should ask them the question while they are warm and dry and on the ground, perhaps sitting back in the mess with a cognac in their hand. Ask a flyer that question a few moments after he has crashed in the cold sea, and perhaps he'll decide differently. I won't. No, because you are an idealist, Christian. I remember the time when you spoke of the Nazis as though they were saviors of our land.
Exactly. In fact, as the old Baron had spoken of them. Now you're disillusioned, continued Löwenherz. You're bitter and resentful of your own ingenuous feelings being. You're angry because the Nazis have never delivered something they didn't promise. Of course I am, said Himmel. But that doesn't mean I was right then, nor that I am wrong now. It means that you should consider matters at greater length and not rush headlong into danger. No. With respect, Herr Oberleutnant, no. We have all delayed too long. While the victories arrived on schedule, we all put our conscience in pawn to success. It's only now, when the future looks less rosy, that we are beginning to wonder if the new order has been built upon sand. But the documents! Himmel, what do you want with them? I made 23 photographic copies of the documents. Each copy was sent by normal mail to a Luftwaffe officer. I considered the list for a long time. Herr Oberleutnant.
You are number 23, that is your copy. The original has been posted to the Medical Inspectorate of the Luftwaffe in Berlin. There was silence. A tuft of cloud was decapitated by the black wing. Other larger tufts raced after it. Then Löwenherz said, "It doesn't make it legal because you sent it only to Luftwaffe officers. It was a highly secret document. It's hardly less secret now that 23 Luftwaffe officers have a copy. But from now on, they can't pretend they don't know of these things. They must protest. They must raise their voices. From now on, they can never say they have not heard of concentration camps. What do you know of concentration camps, Christian? I know, sir. Sirs, that at least 3 airmen at Kroonsdijk have spent time in such places for small political offences. Even if we have 3 times the average, that still leaves 1 man on every Luftwaffe airfield who has been in such a place. How much longer can the whole nation pretend that they don't know what we are doing in Europe? From Bordeaux to Leningrad, prisoners tortured, civilians killed, hostages executed. Now this is something that puts the honour of the Luftwaffe in jeopardy. Reichsmarshal Goering will have received one of these copies. He will understand what must be done. A large cloud fragment swallowed the aeroplane and disgorged it. They will arrest you, Christian, said Löwenherz. Perhaps as soon as tomorrow. Yes, said Himmel. Tomorrow I shall be arrested, but tomorrow I shall not be agonizing with my conscience. Nor shall I be making excuses for the Nazis. Nor shall I be fighting so that even more foreign prisoners can be experimented upon in concentration camps by insane doctors wearing the same uniform that I am wearing. Stop talking! Himmel, I must have time to think. The cloud top was higher inland, and suddenly the Junkers was totally enveloped in it.
Now that it was pressing against the window, it was no longer soft, dry, white, sun-tipped and inviting. It was grey, wet, cold, and threatening. They could see nothing. The cloud gave a curious, unnatural, constant light to the cabin, and the 2 men sat very still, brightly lit and shadowless, like specimens on a microscope slide.